Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. Paul Rahe is a professor of history at Hillsdale College and the author of many books on political theory and classical Greece.
Well, welcome to our audience. I'm Larry Mead from NYU. We appreciate your interest in our subject, which is poverty and culture. What do we mean by culture? Essentially, we mean simply what people think life's about. What are they trying to do? What are they trying to be? What is the goal? And we appreciate your interest in this question. Now, the place we're going to begin is the idea that America is culturally divided. We think of ourselves as somehow a single society. However, the part of America that is most numerous, comes from Europe, and therefore it has a view of life that is characteristic of Europe, which is individualist, and I'll come back to that in a second. But then we also have minorities who are part of the country as well, who come from the non-Western world and not from Europe. And these groups have quite a different view of what life's about. Now, what are the chief differences? Well, the part of America that descends from Europe has a very individualist view of what life's about. That means people more or less decide on their own goals, and their lives are dedicated to achieving those purposes in the outside world. At the same time, they have moralistic ideas of right and wrong. Their actions are disciplined and limited by the fact that they feel they need to observe certain principles about good behavior towards other people. So that is an important dimension also of individualism. Minority groups, on the other hand, come from cultures that are more cautious, where typically people don't seek to advance their own goals, rather they adjust to the outside pressures that hit them from the outside society. And also, they're less aware of themselves as individuals rather than as members of groups. And as to the moral structure, it's dependent much more on context. That is, people do what other people think they should do, and the norms are set by social pressure, really, rather than by generalized principles that people internalize. And that's quite an important difference as well. Now, two important final points. One is that there's no reason to think that one culture is superior to another. They have different strengths and weaknesses. They're good at some things, not good at some other things. And that's true about the West and the non-West. And the other thing is that culture is not in any way inherently connected to race. We tend to think it's the same thing because the groups that are non-Western are also not white. But actually, race has no necessary connection to culture. It all depends how people are socialized. So that's going to be also a big topic of our discussion. So that's a summary of what cultural difference means. And now I'm going to ask Paul to react to that.
I'm going to react to your book as well as to what you're saying, because I pored over it yesterday. And I am struck by the fact that if this book had been written 25 years ago, I don't think it would be very controversial. I don't think you would have been denounced as a racist or anything along those lines. And what's changed since that time is the propensity on the part of certain groups to deliberately muddle the difference between culture and race. So to criticize a culture is to criticize a race.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not true at all. And culture doesn't depend on skin color in any way, or skin color on culture in any way. And what you say in the book is, for the most part, what everyone 25 years ago would say is common sense.
Yeah.
And indeed, there was a literature on the culture of poverty 25 years ago, which I'm sure you are thoroughly familiar with.
I am, but
it's your life thinking about the sources of poverty.
Right.
Now, let me say, when you take this idea of cultural difference and apply it internationally, meaning when you ask questions about how foreign powers conduct their affairs and raise the question, does culture influence this? The answer is obviously. Is it an obstacle to economic development? Is it an obstacle to peace? Obviously. A way of putting it is this. If the culture is communitarian, it's going to be very difficult for an entrepreneur to do much of anything. Yeah. I have a friend who's been trying to set up businesses in a certain part of Africa. And he sort of provides the startup money, helps train the people in this particular enterprise. Yeah. And what he finds is that, let's say they are raising fish to sell in the market. There are other members of their immediate family or a larger family in the clan who will have claims upon them. Yes. And if they succeed, there will have to be a redistribution of wealth, which is, say, someone will come and ask for a fish, and after a while, that you don't have any fish stock left. Correct. Or I have spent a fair amount of time on the Palestinian side. In the West Bank area, because I have a close friend who is a sort of leading Arab figure in that area. And I remember our driver at one point, I was giving lectures at Palestinian universities. Our driver explained to me that once a year, and he had a fleet of taxis, once a year he had to make a gift to every family within his clan. And that amounted to a redistribution of wealth within the clan, yeah. Which meant that it put a damper on his ability to increase the size of the operation. This exists in many places in which the only or the primary loyalty is family. And I mean primary loyalty to a point where there really is nothing much beyond the family. One of the political problems in the Arab world, for example, is that the nations are all artificial. There is a religious sanction for the Nation of Islam, which is to say all Muslims. There is a cultural imperative to look after your family and to think about your family beyond the nuclear family. There really isn't much of an imperative of loyalty to country because, with rare exceptions, Egypt is, I think, an exception to this rule. There are no countries that have a kind of historical claim on you. Yeah. The consequence is weak states, and you've talked about this a bit in your book. Now, the only strong criticism I have of the book is the kind of criticism that historians like myself will always have of social science products, which is they generalize too much and don't attend to the particular enough. So my argument, for example, with realism in foreign policy is they ignore culture. You would accept that argument. Let me give you an example. In your treatment of foreign affairs, there's one country that fits culturally within the framework of poverty, of a culture of poverty that isn't impoverished at all, and that's Japan. That has been extraordinarily successful. If you turn it around and look at this question of the political implications of culture, I'm not so sure Germany is all that individualist. And German culture has a very powerful tendency for conformism and following the leader. Mussolini declared himself Il Duce, the leader, but the Italians didn't really follow Mussolini. Hitler declared himself Der Führer, the leader, and the Germans really did fall in line. So what I would say is the world out there is a little more complicated than your binary distinction makes it. But that's almost inevitable when you're doing social science and generalizing.
Yes.
When you begin to look at the particulars, they don't exactly fit. And there's some mysteries here, which is to say the Germans have been very successful economically. Why were they so conformist? And the Japanese are conformist. Why are they so successful economically?
I address all this in the book, actually. You probably didn't hit on those sections. I want to respond to me, the most important point you made, where I actually disagree. I didn't expect that I would disagree with much of anything you said. But you start off by saying that 25 years ago, the distinctions I draw in cultural terms between different parts of the world would have been accepted as common sense. Actually, I disagree. When I was in graduate school, there was a monolithic commitment to what I would call sameness, the idea that everyone was fundamentally the same. Part of this is because it was in the aftermath of civil rights and the defeat of Jim Crow and the outlawing of explicit racial discrimination had a profound effect on all conceptions in the social science. It was believed that to make any discussion of culture or anything about group difference was racist. And so everyone was the same. And that meant that we could expect blacks to progress towards average levels of income and other forms of achievement within American society. And we should also expect that countries that had been liberated from European empires in the 60s would gradually but palpably converged on Western notions of good government and affluence, and they would become fundamentally quite similar to Europe. Maybe not overnight, but certainly that would be the trend. Well, none of this happened. And since I would say the 80s, it's become very clear in poverty research, certainly, that blacks and other minorities from a non-Western background are having a much more difficult time gaining average incomes than is true for the European population. And that can't really be explained in terms of some explicit barrier or loss of opportunity. And the research world has systematically refused to credit any such notion. And they go on seeking as many barriers as they can conceivably find in the lives of blacks and Hispanics, especially, that might account for their extreme disadvantage compared to the average. And it's no longer persuasive. And the result is most experts, and I know most of them, really have given up trying to explain poverty. By poverty here, I mean primarily long-term poverty rather than episodic poverty that might happen on a short-term basis. So we really have to talk about culture to explain poverty, and that's what I see the experts edging towards that idea. By the way, this is somewhat different from culture of poverty, because in that conception, which goes back to the 60s, the fundamental idea was that people had orthodox goals, but were defeated in achieving them by lack of opportunity. And that is why they gave up and adopted a less constructive lifestyle, where the norms were honored in the breach. But they were still basically conservative, conventional norms. Now, what culture of poverty doesn't do, and I do in my book, is suggest that, in fact, there are more profound differences between the West and the non-West that do have to do with goals and your ideas about what life's about. So culture of poverty doesn't cut deeply enough to characterize the problems that I'm talking about. And as far as third world development, far from it being inevitable, many of the former colonies in Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America have in fact been falling apart ever since the Europeans left. They fundamentally have not been able to govern themselves. And that fact, again, cannot be explained by any external barrier that really can account for it. So that means that we are driven towards an idea that culture is, in fact, a barrier. You said it yourself. Culture is an obstacle to development in a place like the Arab world for the reasons you indicate. But the fundamental difference is that in the West, somehow the forces of change and improvement got the initiative. This occurred in the late Middle Ages, and they've never lost it ever since. And fundamentally, the forces for improvement have gotten the upper hand and have forced the political structure to go along with them. And the upshot has been vast growth in wealth and opportunity in the Western world, such as the world had never seen before. But that isn't true in most of the world today. Even today, most parts of the world are governed by conservative, conformist social ethos, where the leaders expect difference. They resist change because it would diminish their own power. And this has been a fundamental problem in advising on the development of third world countries. You have to confront these cultures. They're fundamentally not constructive. A good associate of mine, Robert Klitgar, is an expert on this, and he's one of several authors who have done very similar to what I do in my book, talk about cultural difference as a fundamental reality in the world. And we didn't really accept that.
Let me draw a distinction because I think there is one between what you have to say about affairs, which in a rough and ready way is, I think, right, and the question of immigration.
Yes.
My family on my mother's side, my family on my father's side is German. My family on my mother's side is Irish. It took a very long time for the Irish to rise up in America. And the reasons were cultural. The Italians and Greeks who came to America took to small business in a big way, moved relatively quickly. The Jews who came to America took to education, professional education, very quickly and moved up rather quickly. The Germans took to business as well. The Irish became cops, mailmen, and politicians. But eventually assimilation took place.
Yes.
And if you look at, to speak about Hispanics is foolish because they come from many different places.
Yeah, they do.
And they were lumped together in an artificial way in the United States Census at some point in the 70s or 80s.
Yeah.
But people coming from a Spanish-speaking background, an awful lot of them have done very well, and some have not. My instinct is that over time, assimilation does take place, and that means adopting new norms, except if you have communities closed in on themselves.
Yeah.
African Americans were closed in on themselves by segregation.
Yeah.
And they remain to some degree closed in on themselves now by dint of feeling uncomfortable in the company of white people. I was once at a dinner in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I had there was a visitor from Kenya who was an old friend of mine that I had brought him in to speak on human rights in Kenya. And the president of the University of Tulsa invited all of the notables from the local Black community. And I ended up next to a state representative who no longer believed in integration and listened to him very carefully. Very polite man. He treated me perfectly well. I sensed then what I have seen in a larger ways since, that the integration effort has stalled.
Yes.
It succeeded, by the way, in the U.S. Army.
Well, right. But you see, the great fact is, this is a major theme in my book, actually, there's a black middle class that has
Yeah.
gone. They have accepted the individualist culture. They have shouldered what I call the burdens of freedom, and they're doing just fine. And the military
Right.
is a leading example of that.
I think if you look more deeply into that, you would find that a very substantial part of that black middle class comes from descendants of free men of color from the North.
Yes.
I know some such people, and they are all they all fit into the category that you're talking about.
That's right.
Now, where you get one of the reasons why, say, Mexico is resistant to the cultural transformation that is required for success is there isn't anything to assimilate to inside Mexico. And the danger is that in a place like California, where you get a large population from one place that coalesces, looks inward to a considerable degree, and takes control politically, that you end up with the assimilation going the other way.
Well, actually, Mexico is ruled by a largely Anglo elite that goes back to before the revolution of 1910 and indeed the independence of the country. The elite in Mexico is mostly white, actually, mostly European, but the bulk of the population is really Native American, and they are thoroughly traditional-minded, thoroughly non-Western, and that's why they have a really hard time in America. But the other fact is that when they come to America, they lose the supporting and restraining structure of external social pressures, which they had in Mexico and Central America. So the problems of social order escalate when they come to America. The families start falling apart when they cross the border. That's because they don't have the internalized form of discipline which the individualist culture presumes. And they have to assimilate to that, which takes several generations. It's the same process you see with blacks, where eventually you get a middle class that has assimilated, but the bulk of the group has not. And therefore, they are not actually typical of the country, not at all. And they have to get assimilated to a more inner-driven way of life. That's very hard for Hispanics. I've seen this in classes, my own students. Their problem isn't that they lack intelligence, and the whole focus on IQ amongst various minorities, especially black, I think is a huge red herring. That isn't actually our major problem. It's simply the way of life that the non-West represents is all about survival. It's not about getting ahead. It's getting through the day. It's rather than organizing your life around the goal. And the fact that Westerners do that and that they're able to internalize the obligations that go along with that, that is their great secret. In fact, I would almost say that the secret of Western culture isn't that it's free. It's almost the opposite, that it is particularly receptive to obligations. That the goals that you internalize about life.
Sure. Let me throw another challenge to you. In the book, you point to the sort of conformist Confucian culture of places like South Korea, Japan, China, and so forth. There's clearly something to that. What's interesting to me is when people come from China to the United States, from Japan to the United States, from Korea to the United States, they conduct themselves very often in much the same way as the Italians who came to the United States and the Greeks who came to the United States, which is to say, restaurants, laundries, small businesses. Furthermore, a generation or two later, these people do exceedingly well in American universities.
No, only in school, not in universities. They don't do well in university. They don't think for themselves. No, patients have a hard time after school. They do very well in school, but that's a structure set by other people which simply tell you what to do. That's what education means in Asia. That's not what it means in America. Certainly by the college level, we expect people to make their own arguments. We expect them to argue with the teachers. And that's something Asians are very reluctant to do. And it's a feature of the entire non-Western world. It's deference to authority. I mean, the great fact about Western culture, now we don't have to go into all the details here, is that it manages both to challenge authority and be willing to contest those in power, but at the same time obeys the laws and pays taxes and therefore has strong government. The question is
So
why.
how do you explain the fact that, say, 2 years ago at Princeton University,
Yeah.
85% of the people who were junior 5/8 were Asian?
That's based on your average, okay? But what happens? And there's a study that came out after my book was written showing that Asians who go into business actually don't do well because they're not willing to be leaders. They want somebody to tell them what to do, and they don't get to the top. And that's also my observation in the academic world. And the areas where Asians do very well are the areas where research is highly structured, where you're doing things that other people have already done and you're elaborating a literature that's already established. But the idea of creating a new conception, something that both of us have done in our own work, is something beyond Asians. That requires that you imagine a new world that no one has ever entered before. You have to have the feeling that the researchers felt when they broke into King Tut's tomb in Egypt and they discovered all this new information about ancient Egypt. Well, I feel that way about many of my subjects that I pursue. It seems to me your books about Sparta and Athens are also like that. They disclose a new world, and it requires a quality of vision, a willingness to imagine something that doesn't exist in the world. That is uniquely Western. In fact, some of my sources point out that theoretical reasoning, the ability to imagine a conception that is not strictly realized in the real world, but which could be realized, that is a uniquely Western feature, not found in Asia, not found anywhere in the non-West. And that is why the West is able to make these giant leaps in conceptions and organizations and business and science, because we trust those inner inspirations and we believe they're true. And
Well,
that's
how then do you explain the success of people from China, India, and Russia in mathematics? Because mathematics really requires rigorous reasoning and
yeah.
Astonishing imagination. I'm not capable of this,
Yeah.
but the different kinds of mathematics, it's really quite remarkable. And the Russians are very good at this.
The Russians are Europe. The Russians are
well, except in your categories, they're orthodox and therefore less individualist than the Catholics, who are less individualist than the Protestants.
So
and how about the Indians and the Chinese, who are very good at mathematics?
The Indians are influenced by the British influence that, after all, formed the country. The British controlled it for 100 years. The education system was essentially taken over by the British and formed in their own image. And the people who go through that are very highly selected. Many of them come to graduate school in this country. Indeed, I have friends who are Indians. They're not at all typical of Asia in general. They do very well here. They are quite capable of imagination, but they're not typical of India. That is a small, tiny elite. And in East Asia, you don't find that even among the elite. The elite may be good at certain subjects, but primarily they're technicians. They take a structure that other people have developed and they elaborate it. So Asia in general, and this is true of Japan, is good at technology, but not good at science. And most of the Nobel Prizes are won by people in the West. Where Japan excels is in patents for the technical application of knowledge. They're very good at that. And the other Asians are good at it as well. But what you don't find in Asia is the capacity for an independent mind. That simply isn't part of the culture. And
that's interesting. I know the Muslim world a bit. I lived in Turkey for 2 years and learned the language. And I have spent a certain amount of time in the Arab world. And one of the striking features to me is of those two cultural areas is the enormous number of engineers.
Yes.
And the small number of scientists.
Yes.
There was a report done for the United Nations by a group of Arab intellectuals And one of the things they focused in on, this is about 10 years ago, was the absence of patents.
Yes.
In the Arab world. Nobody filing for patents because research wasn't being done.
Yeah.
And yet, the number of people in Turkey, the number of people in the Arab world trained as engineers is enormous.
That's very well put, and that's important because it shows that cultural difference isn't really about mental capacity. It really isn't. There are very, very talented people in just the areas you mentioned. Now, Turkey is a little bit different because there's a strong Western influence. I mean,
Sure.
Ed tried to turn the country into a Western country in the early 20th century. But the other thing that's very important is to me, quixotic influence of Islam. Islam has many resemblances to Western religions. If you look at where it comes from, the background is almost biblical. In fact, it's in part is biblical. And Asia, rather, as Islam thinks of itself as a conceptual idea, really, of an idea of God and associated obligations to go with, and so on. That's their conception. But in fact, Islam never developed the free intellect and the qualities of individualism that go along with Judaism and Christianity. They are altogether committed to the free individual. Whereas Islam has a period of enormous creativity in its early history, but then it drops back and the religious orthodoxy takes over and imposes control. And so in the end, Islam is like the rest of the non-Western world in having an essentially external idea of authority. Whereas in the biblical tradition, in Judaism and Christianity, authority begins as something external, but is internalized and becomes the moralism of Western culture.
Right. There's another dimension to this, and that is in the Christian West, and picked up by many Jews, you get a development of an idea of nature. And you will find it in the Christian Bible. You will not find it in the Jewish Bible. And you won't find it in Islam. The alternative to the idea of nature is the notion that all order is a standing miracle, constantly renewed by God.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the idea of nature presupposes a God that creates nature and to some degree stands back from it.
Yeah.
And that miracles are the exception, not the rule. If miracles are the exception, not the rule, there's something to study that human beings can understand.
Yes.
If miracles are the rule and God is mysterious, as all of these religions suppose, God being mysterious, then there's nothing to study.
That's right. I think that's exactly it. And Islam, what Islam doesn't do is allow the mind to pursue its own way in the belief that God intends human understanding to comprehend the world.
Yeah, right.
God created the world. God authorizes the intellect as a way of figuring out the world. Whereas in Islam, and to a lesser extent in the Eastern religions, there's fear of the intellect, because the intellect might, after all, think independent thoughts, and it might break down social order. So in Asia, you really don't find that acceptance of the independent mind. That really isn't part of their culture.
Now, you're not going to like what I'm about to say, but the mentality that you are talking about is the dominant mentality in ancient Athens,
yes,
as well as ancient Sparta, and you can see it in Sophocles' Oedipus.
Yeah.
Oedipus's problem is he has confidence in his own intellect, in his capacity to solve problems, and it turns out that there's this fundamental mystery that he doesn't understand. And that's in other words, the rationalists in Greece, and they existed, which does distinguish Greece from Islam, uh, is they were sort of freaks on the periphery of society.
Yeah.
Of some significance for the upper class.
Yeah.
In a place like Athens, and later in a place like Rome. But in fact, their way of thinking is not the dominant way of thinking. And so you end up having these religious scandals in late 5th century Athens.
I think that's right. I think that's
which are a kind of popular rebellion against this intellectual elite.
Yeah, there's one of my historians actually comments on the fact that the great period of classical Greece in the 5th century BC and to some extent before and after that time, you have a willingness to deal with an unstructured intellect, even though it meant that social order was in some sense at risk. And of course, that's what happened to Socrates. Socrates is ultimately executed because he was too dangerous as a free intellect. And so eventually, the classical world went back to external authority in the form first of Orthodox Christianity and then Islam. So Islam imposes an order that's external. And from that point on, the free intellect migrates really to Europe. And Europe becomes the place where we find an individual's culture most fully developed. But it does begin in the Bible and in classical Greece. In fact, we had some email exchanges about this when I was reading your books about the Peloponnesian Wars. What struck me was how enormously energetic the Greeks were, and how every Greek seemed to be worth 5 or 10 Persians in the battle that they went through. And when it wasn't always easy to mobilize the Greeks for a common cause, but once they were mobilized, they were immensely formidable because of the energy which they generated in every individual. Whereas in Persia, there are immense numbers of people who are obeying orders from the emperor, but they're really not thinking. They're really not devoting their full energy to solving a problem.
Well, and connected with that is the fact that having been defeated by the Greeks, they don't carry out a military reform.
Yes.
That would allow them to fight more effectively. So in the 5th century, the Athenians defeat the Persians over and over again, which should not happen. And the only people within the Persian Empire who are partial exception to this are the Phoenicians, who pioneer the use of the trireme.
Yeah.
But the thing to understand about the Phoenicians is they're not fighting for themselves when they fight for Persia.
Yeah. Yes.
They don't have the same motive that the Greeks have when they fight. Whereas the Carthaginians do have that motive.
Well, the Carthage was defeated by Rome. It wasn't defeated by Athens.
Right, but if you look at the number of years that it took for the Romans to defeat the Carthaginians, they were formidable. And there is a transformation that takes place between antiquity and the modernity that emerges in the 17th century. And that transformation results in Carthage beating Rome.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, Britain defeats France.
Yes.
They defeat France. They defeat Louis XIV, eventually, the British and the Dutch.
Yep.
And what happens in between is the emergence of the primacy of sea power, which Alfred Thayer Mahan later celebrates in the influence of sea power upon history. And his history starts in the 17th century. So it's very interesting. He doesn't quote Thucydides or Pericles, though he's read him. It's Montesquieu that he quotes. And Montesquieu is the kind of prophet. He's the person who, and he has one predecessor whom I'll mention to you because it will amuse you. He sees that money has become the sinews of war, that the commercial powers that are on the water and therefore have cheap transportation ready to hand, this is before the railroad, are going to be dominant. And what that means is Britain, which cannot compare to France in population,
That's right.
and the Netherlands, which is a postage stamp, are able to defeat not only Louis XIV but eventually Napoleon.
Yes,
Uh,
they're quite extraordinary. These cultures have a kind of energy which is simply not found in the non-Western world. The other thing that's remarkable about Britain and also the Netherlands is that they combine this immense dynamism of the society with strong government. The British have a political genius that allows them to solve their major political problems deep
Sure.
in the ages. And this means that they have not only the enormous wealth that comes from a capitalist economy, but a government able to tax that wealth and use it to fight for their own goals and to fight.
Absolutely.
Versus,
Montesquieu talks about this in Book 19, Chapter 27 at length. Both those things. Now the interesting thing is this understanding. Montesquieu owes to the 7-8 months that he spent in England, but there is a book prior to Montesquieu that lays it out. In 1690, I've only recently discovered this. A man named Nicholas Barbone writes a book arguing, this is before the defeat of Louis XIV, that the British will be able to defeat Louis XIV, and he makes this argument in full. Now, here's what's interesting about Nicholas Barbone. He's a merchant.
Yeah.
His father is, praise God, Barbones, one of the Puritan zealots during the English Revolution.
Yeah.
So you go from Protestant zealotry to a rather cynical commercialism on the part of Nicholas Barbone, and to a vision of the way the commercial revolution is going to transform the projection of power.
See, but that works only if you combine an individualist economy with a government that, although accountable to the people, is nonetheless capable of collective action.
Sure.
This the British achieved very, very early. And what I think the political science world has never understood or appreciated is how crucial that capacity to combine order and freedom was to the entire dominance of Europe, and especially to the English and then the Americans. That this capacity to be dynamic and to allow for endless change, and yet never to fly apart, and to maintain a fundamental order, is unique to the West, and especially the English countries, because they have that to a greater extent than any other countries. And it isn't possible, and this is where the idea of sameness is completely wrong. It isn't really possible for people with a non-Western culture to achieve this, because they are too dependent on external authority to maintain order. They have to choose between order and freedom. They cannot have both. And that's the great dilemma that we find in development in pretty much the entire non-Western world, that they're really not able to do that. But the only country that really shows a capacity to govern as well as to be free is really Japan.
I was going to bring that up.
Japan.
Tell me, talk about how did the Japanese do it? Because let me add something about Japan.
Yeah.
The teaching of Western civilization has been virtually banned in the United States.
Yeah.
From our colleges and universities.
I know.
It is alive and well in Japanese universities.
Okay.
The old understanding of the rise of the West, the significance of the rise of the West, the puzzle of what occasioned the rise of the West, is something that is still taught in Japan as it was taught in the United States, say in 1950.
The Japanese, when they were about to enter into their great period of power, they themselves reformed their government. This is the Meiji Restoration of 1860.
Sure.
And then they took counsel from other Western countries, including America. The whole government left the country for about 2 years and toured the Western world, seeking to find out what they might learn from us. That was something that other non-Western countries, and notably China, refused to do. They believed they had nothing to learn from the West. The Japanese are quite ready to learn. But the thing that really stood them apart was a political gift, almost like the British. They combined a strong emperorship and then the shogun, who's the military ruler. These figures have authority going way, way back in the Middle Ages. And at the same time, they allowed for open political contention in a way that China never allowed. And the upshot was that over time, the regime became simultaneously strong, but also tolerant of political conflict. And finally, in the 19th century, they pull that together and they have a representative government, which nonetheless has great authority. And so they're able to do what the Westerners can do, and that is to combine order and freedom. Now, it's still a highly collective country, not individualist. That's absolutely true. And it has the limitations of a collective culture, but it also has the power to mobilize masses of people for great causes. And of course, that's what they did in their run up to empire in the 20th century. I mean, they made only really one mistake, and that is they attacked Pearl Harbor. And they knew, in fact, they should have known, and they did, in fact, know, that the only thing that would stop them from dominating Asia was the United States.
Sure. And Yamamoto opposed the expedition on which he was sent because he thought it was going to backfire.
It's the puzzle. But the funny thing, but according to what I read about World War II, actually the Americans triumphed not only because they were richer and bigger and could build more ships and planes. That was true, but also they delegated far more responsibility for problem solving to the junior officers and people down the line. And so the whole system was involved in problem solving. And that's why they beat the Japanese, as much as the Japanese were simply outgunned. The Japanese didn't do that. Their leadership was brilliant as long as they were expanding. But the people under them were ready to die for the emperor, but they weren't ready to think for themselves. Because that's the thing.
Let me shift you.
Yeah.
What do you do with Taiwan?
What do I do? What?
What do you do with Taiwan?
Taiwan is a fragment of China, which has been strongly westernized by American influence mostly. And it does have a democratic character. It is, in a certain sense, a free country. And it also has moderately honest government. In fact, if you look at the World Bank indicators for major countries, South Korea and Taiwan are the only close competitors that Japan has for quality of government in Asia. They're not quite at the Japanese level. And I think the reason is they're less autonomous. They didn't really do it themselves. Japanese did do it themselves. And they had this. I mean, one of my sources says that Japan is so much like Europe, it should have been towed away and anchored off the Isle of Wight, because it has a political genius that only the British showed to the same extent in Europe. And that's still true today. Japan, after all, recovered from World War II and became a great economic power, and they're still a very formidable country. Their problems are mostly social. Their population is declining. They have a number of serious problems. Their economy has been more or less moribund for a couple of decades. So they're not doing as well as they were, but the capacity to be a dynamic society and at the same time well-governed is something Japan shows to a greater extent, really, than any other Asian country. The only parallel, really, is Singapore, which is created by a single great statesman, Lee Kuan Yew, who more or less took it over and made it honest and efficient. The Japanese did it collectively, and they did it for centuries ahead of the typical Asian experience. And in particular, there's no parallel in China. China has never accepted open politics, has never accepted open political conflict, has never accepted accountability to the society. So the regime in China is profoundly weak, although right now they're able to dominate the country. And of course, China is a huge society, so they can generate enormous power. But what they don't have is a deeply rooted dynamism in the society, and they don't have a leadership that is profoundly legitimate as Japan does. So they're going to face problems. I think China is likely to have significant difficulties holding together as they go forward. And indeed, the country's broken up a number of times in its past history.
Sure.
So that never happened in Japan. It never happened in America. These countries have a political capacity that's much greater than you find in Asia, except for Japan. And that is why I don't think we should be so afraid of China. China is threatening mainly because It's big, and also because it doesn't have the moralism of the West. It doesn't have a deeply rooted commitment to universal moral values that mean you have to care about other people, and you have to care about the less fortunate, and you have to help other countries solve their problems. Japan has, in fact, neither Japan nor China has that idea at all. Because in Asia, ethical structure is all limited to one's immediate surroundings. See, that's the basic fact about ethics outside the West. Only the West has this moralistic streak, also driven by the penchant for theoretical thinking, that allows the West to assume responsibility for the entire world. And we feel we should do that. But we're not going to get any help from these countries. They're getting richer, but they're not, by that fact, becoming more moralistic. I don't think that's going to happen. We're going to see most of the non-Western world is going to be dominated by oligarchic regimes that are fundamentally out for themselves, which are not really accountable to the rest of the society, because they really can't afford freedom. Freedom is too threatening to them.
Okay, one last challenge.
Okay.
You spent the bulk of your career writing about the institutional foundations of poverty.
Yes.
And about tinkering with institutions.
Yes.
To discourage people from remaining in poverty.
Discourage is the wrong word. Motivate.
Right. Okay. I still liked what you wrote earlier. And I find myself, when I read your, on the international side, I think your argument is in a rough and ready way right, though not nuanced enough, but leave that aside. On the domestic side, I think that you don't pay enough attention to the work of this guy, Larry Mead, who did very good work some years back. And
it's
and who had a considerable effect on American public policy. Can you defend yourself against Larry Mead?
Yeah, no, I think it's consistent. The main argument I made in my earlier books was that we had to expect people on welfare to work in return for aid. In other words, their fate in life could not consist only of making rights and claims. They should also have obligations, including working and paying taxes and all the other things that go with the burdens of freedom. And what I have done in the recent book is understand in greater depth where those obligations come from. And I really redefined freedom as a form of obligation. So that is actually consistent with what I wrote earlier. And it works culturally as well, because the heavily poor, not all the cases, but the long-term poor, are predominantly non-Western. And they respond very positively to external authority because they're non-Western. And they tend not to resist. Now, the